According to the U.S. Census, 1.7% of the population in the United States is Native American or Alaskan Native, yet the level of domestic violence and rape among Native women far surpasses that of the non-Native population. To talk about some of the reasons why this is the case, I'm joined by Truthout contributor Tanya Lee. Her article on Truthout is entitled "A National Disgrace: Violence Against Native Women." Hello, Tanya. Welcome to Truthout Interviews.
Thank you very much, Ted.
So tell us about the kind of gender-based violence that indigenous women face.
Basically, for both men and women, American Indian, Alaska Native people experience violence at about 2.5 times the rate as the general population. For women, 1 in 3 American Indian, Alaska Native women report that they have been raped in their lifetimes. There are rural villages in Alaska where that number is 100%. About 60% of American Indian, Alaska Native women report that they have been assaulted in their lifetimes. And I don't know what the number for the general population is, but I know it's nowhere near that.
You know, with this spike in gender-based violence, you know, there's this added lack of justice within the Native populations among the tribes. Now, can you give us some of the highlights? Because your article on Truthout really sort of lays out in sort of a long arc of history why this is the case, but because we can't go through and sort of look at that individually, maybe you could give us some of the highlights about this history, about how the law kind of bends towards the protection of non-Indian perpetrators in crimes like domestic violence, rape, and all sorts, you know, and other types of violence against women within indigenous populations.
Let's see, in 1885, the federal government passed the Major Crimes Act. And what that act said was that all major crimes, rape, murder, and crimes such as that, committed on Indian lands would be prosecuted by the federal government, not by the tribes themselves. And that was further complicated in, oh my gosh, I'm going to forget my year. I think it was 1953 when the Indian Civil Rights Act took away from tribes the right to sentence perpetrators of any crime for more than 1 year or a fine of $3,000. And then in 1978, Oliphant, which was a case that went to the Supreme Court, determined that tribes did not have the right to prosecute non-Indians for any crimes committed on Indian reservations. And that's a major problem because actually a lot of non-Indians live on reservations. And so this meant that all of the non-Indian men, usually it is in domestic violence cases, living on the reservation were pretty much immune to prosecution for any domestic violence crimes. And the reason for this is that when those crimes are prosecuted by the federal government rather than by the tribe, you have a huge problem of law enforcement people right on the scene, which there are a precious few of, whether it's a tribal law enforcement agency or a federal law enforcement agency. You also have the problem that if those crimes are tried in federal court, the witnesses, the victim, have to go to a federal court, which is usually in a major city as opposed to anywhere near a reservation. And so that's a huge burden on the victim, basically.
Within the tribes, they have their own legal structure, but throughout the years and the decades, that has been eroded to the point where it's ineffective, and so now we're seeing this spike in violence because people feel like, I guess, that they can get away with things and nothing's going to happen to them.
And that's absolutely true. That is what's happened. On Indian reservations, many tribes do have their own legal systems and their own law enforcement personnel, but really the only tribes that have adequate funding for those things are the very few tribes that have done well in gaming or natural resources development. So you need, for those systems to work, whether it's law enforcement or tribal courts, you need a huge amount of federal support. And as in most things pertaining to Indian country, there is not nearly enough of that support. Those things are so way underfunded that in some cases the tribes literally can't keep their jails standing up. Congress has begun to make some inroads. The Senate Committee on Indian Affairs in 2007 held hearings on the prevalence of violence against Native women. And partly out of that, and partly out of other hearings on law and order in Indian country, the Tribal Law and Order Act was signed into law by President Obama in 2010. And what that did was it gave tribes a whole range of increased rights in terms of law enforcement on their own lands. And one of the things it did was to increase the sentence that a tribal court could impose to 3 years in jail and a fine of or a fine of up to $15,000, which means that when you're looking at something like beating up a woman to the point where she's near death, you can at least get closer to a more appropriate sentence for that person if he is found guilty.
So this act was to try to, in a way, supersede or at least get around the Supreme Court decision in Oliphant in a way.
Yes, that's right, and also the Indian Civil Rights Act, which limited tribal sentencing authority. When the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization was passed in 2013, that is the one that directly dealt with the issue of non-Indian perpetrators of violent crime against women. And what that said is it reversed Oliphant to some degree. It said that in certain instances, tribal courts would be allowed to prosecute non-Indian perpetrators or alleged perpetrators of domestic crime against women and children.
Politics is a pretty messy process, and you even highlight in your article that the Republicans have taken steps to try to block any kind of funding for the act that President Obama signed into law. The rationale behind it was, maybe you could explain what that is.
The rationale behind it was that there was a lot of fear that tribal courts would not treat white perpetrators fairly. Now, there is in fact no evidence for this. The evidence is that tribal courts bend over backwards to make sure that people get fair hearings. The other thing you're seeing in this administration is a huge amount of racism. And that's a lot of what you're seeing in these objections to tribes taking over their own justice systems, and especially to tribes being able to prosecute non-Indian men, usually, for crimes against indigenous women. And the racism you see, in my opinion, you see particularly strongly in Alaska, where the governor is very much against revising the Violence Against Women Reauthorization to include Alaska Native villages. And it's in Alaska Native villages where this crime against indigenous women is most serious, because these places are so very rural that they're not accessible to the state agents who should be going out there and catching and prosecuting criminals, except sometimes by airplane for 9 months of the year. They're just not going to get there. They're not going to be able to do it. These communities need to be able to police themselves.
Tanya, I want to thank you for being on Truthout and to bring to light some of what you wrote in your piece, and to talk a little bit more in detail about gender-based violence within the indigenous communities around North America and really worldwide.
Well, I thank you so much for the opportunity to speak on this really important issue.
Tanya Lee is a journalist whose most recent piece on Truthout is entitled "A National Disgrace: Violence Against Native Women." Thanks for watching Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo. We'll see you next time.